press conference was the response to the question actually from Sky's own Beth Rigby, in which the chief medical officer, he was asked, well, look, Angela Merkel says it will be 70% of you will get ill. And he said, well, look, I don't want to talk about figures I'm not absolutely certain of. He said, but the upper estimate for us is higher than 70% of the country will get ill. And I think that really brought home for a lot of people, definitely I felt it brought home to me just how serious and long-lasting this whole situation is going to be.
And also the suggestion that the peak really might not come until 14 weeks' time.
Yes, that it could be taking us well into the heart of summer. But that's why I think the advice was so clearly laid out today, and I think done in a proper way, that whilst they do expect that many more people in the UK will be diagnosed with it, will get it, in the worst case scenario, over 70%, we've seen 80% of people in the UK could be infected, it's very important to remember that many people will not even show symptoms. Those who do show symptoms, again, the vast majority of them are likely to have relatively minor symptoms, but that's why people are being asked to really pick up the mantle here and take on their civic duty. If you do have a new constant cough, or if you do have a new fever, to self-isolate for 7 days, because now it's not just about what you as a person may go through. For many healthy people out there, the symptoms will be mild. It's about what you can be passing on, and we do know that this virus can be, especially when you first get it, very contagious.
But it does rely on people doing the right thing, doesn't it, and having that moral duty and carrying it out.
Well, that is the big difficulty. I think actually in many ways the most significant statement this week in terms of whether or not we get through this was not by Boris Johnson today. It was Rishi Sunak pulling two levers. The first lever, of course, was money for businesses who are going to struggle, and the second was tax credits and various other benefits. But if you are self-employed, it's actually very difficult for you to self-isolate. And the question is, although he was very ambitious, much more ambitious than many other European leaders, was he ambitious enough? Has he provided enough financial support for people to stay home in all cases? And if he hasn't, well, that will be when things get very difficult.
The Telegraph obviously looking at the financial implications and the market meltdown, worst day since 1987. The markets have really taken a thumping today.
Yes, they have, and this is a very interesting circumstance in which they have, because usually when you see the markets tumble like this, when you start to become concerned about a recession, it's because the markets are reacting to something happening economically or financially, but in this case, they're reacting to a virus. So actually there's plenty of hope that if the virus were to subside, if we were to overcome this in the near future, that the markets could recover. But at the same time, that temporary shock can be very painful. And, people don't really like the economic jargon that goes around, especially during a crisis, because they're most concerned about public health, and that's completely reasonable. But it is important to remember that economic costs can very quickly become human costs. So we saw today that Norwegian Airlines has had to scale back a lot of flights. They've had to make people temporarily redundant. That has real implications for people's jobs and people's livelihoods. So it's a very important factor in this discussion as well.
And as you were saying, Stephen, a lot of small businesses really not knowing whether they can weather the storm, because they have no idea how long the storm will last.
Yeah, because this is what's called a demand shock. Takes a bunch of customers out of the economy, and therefore they struggle. Rishi Sunak used an important phrase, whatever it takes. But one of the things that I think is key to this story is how markets are reacting to the, I think, actually very reckless and foolish statement by the head of the European Central Bank. Now, in 2012, during the financial crisis, Mario Draghi also used the phrase, whatever it takes, the same phrase Rishi Sunak used. That calmed markets. Christine Lagarde basically went, not our problem. And I think that is one of the reasons why markets are so panicked.
The final paper, just the Metro, actually going back to the Metro again, and back to Rishi Sunak saying that he makes no apologies for the 30 billion budget. This will go down as the coronavirus budget, won't it?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it will. I think actually the interesting thing, though, is actually what Rishi Sunak announced in terms of coronavirus was very sensible and incredibly orthodox. I think essentially every economist, if you've got them in the room, some of them might think he was ambitious enough, but they'd all say he pulled the right levers. The odd thing, and I don't want to put words into Kate's mouth, is that slightly meant that I think he's got away with a budget that has been quite radical in terms of the role it sees for the government in the overall market. And perhaps if this wasn't the COVID budget, it would be the budget in which a lot of people on the right were going, hang on a minute, did we defeat Corbyn merely to become Ed Miliband?
Well, precisely. A lot of people are saying you could have seen John McDonnell stand up and give this budget. I don't think that's accurate. You know, vast parts of industry haven't been nationalized and the rest of it. But the OBR has been comparing it to a Gordon Brown budget, which is to suggest that in terms of spending, in terms of state intervention, it really is taking plays out of the labor playbook. But I think we have to separate this to be responsible about his spending commitments. There's what he's spending to tackle the coronavirus. He said he'll do whatever it takes, but so far that's amounted to £12 billion to go into the NHS, to go into sick pay and the rest. Then there's the £18 billion that, as Stephen's mentioning, he clearly wanted to spend on other projects. Now, some of that might have a knock-on effect on coronavirus, but we're talking about a lot of infrastructure spending, a lot of big spending coming from a conservative government. And if you look at the charts from yesterday, they are really racking up that deficit again that we've spent a decade trying to bring down. So yeah, there are question marks about the overall trajectory of this conservative government, but right now, obviously, all focus is on the coronavirus, and I think there's pretty much broad agreement that what he's brought in terms of that £12 billion makes a lot of sense.
Okay, Kate and Stephen, for the moment, thank you. And our coverage of the crisis continues on Sky News at breakfast tomorrow. The government's chief scientific advisor, Patrick Vallance, will be giving us the very latest official advice as the UK moves to the delay phase. That's Sky News at breakfast, live from 7 a.m. Coming up, though, a historically bad day for the world's financial markets. We'll look at more of the outbreak's repercussions when we come back. The impact that it's having worldwide. Financial Times obviously looking at the global markets and what's happened there.
So the global markets have now been in panic for quite a few days, really up to a week. But the new news is that the FTSE 100 has taken a real tumble, the worst since the 1987 Black Monday crash. And again, this goes back to what we were saying before the break about how the cost of the virus is translating to the economy. And that doesn't just mean, who's making more money, who's making less money. This comes down to what businesses can stay afloat, whether or not they can get loans to do so, whether or not people are going to be made redundant, whether or not supply chains, which means, parts from China can make it to Germany's auto industry or make it to the pharmaceutical companies in America to produce, not just the cars, but really right now we're talking about the medicines that people need. And so there's real panic within the markets right now, and one of the problems is that a lot of these banks have already pulled the levers they need to pull. Interest rates are incredibly low. It's going to be harder to kickstart the markets again when we need to do so.
Stephen, I'm going to throw a word that we haven't heard quite so often in the last few days, Brexit. The trade talks with the EU are on hold because of coronavirus.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, it feels slightly trivial given everything going on, but actually there's a really important Brexit story here, which is the government has committed to take us out of the economic project by the 31st of December. Of course, we are now out of the political project already. Now, that involves a series of very difficult, very hard-boiled negotiations. That involves preparing the infrastructure fully for us to be a genuine third country. Can you do that at the same time as combating coronavirus? Certainly a big ask, and I think actually that is going to be the kind of question that people I think are going to start asking, not right away because politicians are going to feel a bit awkward raising it in the sort of the height of the crisis, but people are going to say, look, really, this is going to be a lost year for Europe, a lost year for the United Kingdom, a lost year for China, a lost year for the United States. Some people go, look, well, basically what Rishi Sunak is trying to say is to the banks is don't worry about mortgages, don't worry about debt, let's just write this year off and we can just pretend it didn't happen at the end of it. If we're really saying that to the market, shouldn't we also be saying that in the Brexit negotiation and basically saying, okay, look, we'll leave on the 31st in 2021?
We shall see. Very quickly, let's just look at the Metro and Tom Hanks and his wife testing positive. That's the story there.
Yes, Tom Hanks, American actor, really an American hero, just given the films that he's been in, released a statement saying that him and his wife had tested positive after showing mild symptoms. And the Metro is highlighting all the celebrity kind words that are coming in to support them. But,
lots of support coming in.
Lots of support.
Kate and Stephen, thank you very much. Coming up next on Sky News at 11.
Scientists advising the government is things that you
you've sacrificed to be able to...
World will be called upon to help. Thomas Moore, Sky News.
This is...
Antibiotics that can treat pneumonia. There are respirators. We are better equipped, and I'm quite optimistic that, okay, let's say by April, sometime in April, we will have effective therapy. There's reasonable hope that we will know soon. Vaccine, that's going to take a much longer time.
The big concern is Africa. Ebola had a catastrophic impact on countries with under-resourced health services. Deaths from coronavirus could be even greater. And once again, the world will be called upon to help. Thomas Moore, Sky News.
This is Sky News. Coming up, the Premier League calls an emergency meeting after Arsenal head coach Mikel Arteta is confirmed to have COVID-19. £160 billion wiped off the value of shares. And after American and British troops were injured in airstrikes earlier in the week, the Pentagon has confirmed that the US carried out retaliatory strikes against militia in Iraq. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the New Statesman's political editor, Stephen Bush, and the Spectator's economics correspondent, Kate Andrews. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. And the Daily Telegraph carries the Prime Minister's sombre warning that the COVID-19 outbreak is likely to mean many more families are going to lose loved ones. The Metro leads with the same headline, with Boris Johnson disregarding any plans for a shutdown. The Guardian also focuses on the Prime Minister's words, adding that coronavirus is the worst public health crisis in a generation. The front page of the Times carries the same headline and features an image of the Prime Minister against the falling stock market. Unsurprisingly, the Financial Times leads with a traumatic day for the stock market, with the FTSE 100 suffering its biggest one-day loss since Black Monday in 1987. The Eye describes the virus advice outlined by the Chief Medical Officer, saying people with mild symptoms should stay at home for 7 days. The Mail describes the Prime Minister's words as a chilling warning for families. Boris, many families will lose loved ones, is also the headline for the Daily Express. The Daily Mirror asks if the new measures introduced by the government will be enough to tackle the spread of COVID-19. And away from the coronavirus outbreak, the Daily Star goes with football star Eric Cantona, who could be joining I'm a Celebrity. Well, we're joined tonight by Kate Andrews and Stephen Bush. Welcome back to you both. Starting obviously with coronavirus and having a look at the Mail front page there. And that chilling quote, many loved ones will die, the point at which everyone watching that news conference this afternoon stood up.
Yeah, it was really a sobering moment. So there are nearly 600 people who have been diagnosed with coronavirus in the UK. Thousands more have been tested, shown to be negative. But the Prime Minister said today that they estimate that up to 10,000 people in the UK now could have the virus. They know it's spreading, which is why they've moved from containing the virus into the delay phase in which we try to push this process out. 10 people have died so far, and what the Prime Minister was saying today in very somber tone was that that number is going to rise. And it's very important for the government, especially the Prime Minister, to be honest with the public in a moment like this. I don't think these words are intentionally meant to frighten people, but it's very important that people understand that this is going to get worse before it gets better. And they do not want to be seen downplaying the effect of coronavirus on the public. We've seen already what's happened in America, and we're going to come to the story a bit later, where Donald Trump brushed it off and said it was absolutely fine and has had to row back significantly. It undermines public trust. And so I think by being so honest with the public today, the government is certainly trying to keep trust on their side, because it's going to be weeks, if not months, as we go through this process together. And listening to public health advice, listening to what the Prime Minister has to say in moments like this is extremely important.
It was a very detailed briefing, wasn't it? And suggesting that perhaps the worst we might not see the worst until 14 week's time.
Yeah, I mean, slightly weird thing to say, fortunately, but fortunately, the UK now has quite a lot of experience of dealing with health scares because of much less serious things like BSE and foot in mouth. And this was very much a sort of kind of fairly typical rollout from that perspective, but I think was very good at giving people a great deal of information, making the experts freely available, and you have to hope that it will be enough to tackle what is the most serious public health crisis since HIV/AIDS first burst onto the scene.
And the eye, having a look at that, the advice that's actually given people, even if they're presenting with slight symptoms, the advice is to stay at home if you have a new cough or a fever.
Yep, so the advice has been updated today. What we're learning about the virus is that it can be most contagious when you first get it. So even if your symptoms are mild, you could be very contagious. So they're saying to people, if you have a cough, if you have a new cough, or if you have a fever, you need to stay at home for 7 days. Now, it's important to remember, because a lot of people will be very nervous about this advice, nervous about what's happening around the world in terms of shutdowns in other parts of the world, that the vast majority of people who do get coronavirus will either have no symptoms or relatively mild symptoms. It's going to be much worse if you have an underlying condition. So you might feel like you're pretty okay, but the reality is that you could be contagious and spread that to others. So there really is a civic duty now that if you feel unwell, even if you think you can go out of the house, for the sake of others, stay at home, work from home, be at home. And that could really help take the burden off the healthcare services, which are no doubt going to struggle as more and more people need access to medical care.
The Times, that picture on the front page of the Times is actually quite telling with Boris Johnson there and the markets. We can see how drastically they've taken a hammering.
Yeah, although actually, I mean, in many ways, actually, the big event here today in terms of the markets was not anything Boris Johnson said or even some of the terrifyingly, clearly ill-briefed things that Donald Trump said, but it was the decision of the European Central Bank not to do what the Bank of England, the Fed and other central banks did and cut rates. And that is the thing which has really spooked markets, partly because the thing that what we're essentially, and France is doing and Germany's doing, is going, look, this can be a very difficult time for small businesses in particular, a very difficult time for the self-employed. Don't worry, we'll give you the money because we know that you're good for it and it will just, increase national debt, but it'll be fine. And the ECB going, oh, well, actually, we're not sure that yields are our business, has made banks get a bit more spooked and go, does that mean Italian debt isn't safe to service? Now, I think that it's incorrect, and actually I think national governments have got the right answer on this. But the big problem here is the ECB's decision to, instead of doing what Rishi Sunak did, what they did in 2012 and go, whatever it takes, basically go, whatever. And that is the real story of that terrifying graph.
And it's interesting because usually when we see markets react in this way and we see the value of stocks fall and the rest of it, it's because they're responding to something economic, something happening in finance or in the market. But in this case, they're reacting to a virus and the way that governments are reacting to that virus. If we were to get coronavirus under control relatively quickly, you could see things recover pretty quickly, although there would be consequences from this time where we haven't had supply chains working properly, where businesses have had to shut down or close for periods of time. But the government, in many ways, has already pulled the levers it might need if, say, another recession were to come, one that was more based on the markets rather than a virus. So they're in a tricky spot.
You mentioned there sort of small business and how they cope with not really knowing how this is going to pan out and might have to lay staff off, staff working from home. I mean, extremely difficult circumstances for, small to medium enterprise.
Yeah, because this is a slightly weird economic situation in that if your business loses money, it's not because your business is based on a bad thing or you've broken the rules. It's because your customers are staying home. Now, let's take hotels, right? If you're the Hilton Hotel, you just eat into your reserves, you have a slightly painful quarter, but you're fine. If you are a small boutique hotel, somewhere in the UK, it's a lot more painful for you. Small businesses are the main creators of jobs in the economy, right? They're the advantage to big business, but small businesses are big generators of jobs. So the thing the government desperately wants to do is keep those small businesses alive, essentially by being a lender of last resort for them.
Let's take a look at the Metro, and then the big question is, how is this all going to end? How is it going to play out?
So this graph that you see here has been doing the rounds today, and what the government was trying to show today in its press conference was how they're trying to push the peak of the virus down the road, because they're concerned that if we hit the peak of the virus now and we have people getting the most number of cases, or at least diagnosed cases now, the strain on the NHS and the health services is going to be too much to bear. So they're trying to push us down the road, and they think that the peak could be in 10 to 14 weeks' time. But that has other implications. That means that we'll be living with this virus for much longer. It means that the struggle continues on. And one of the things that's been highlighted today is that the UK is taking a very different approach to other major countries like Ireland, like Italy, like France, which are shutting down schools, shutting down big events. The UK is trying to push off those measures for many different reasons. I mean, and there's some good ones too. If you do say shut down schools, well, what happens to the doctors and nurses who have to look after their kids? There are knock-on effects here. But a lot of those comparisons are being drawn, and some people are skeptical of the government's tactics. Others are very much listening to the experts that we saw in the press conference.
On the schools, they were suggesting that what you don't want to do is peak too early, and timing is of the essence. They're not saying that they might not close schools, but just at the moment it would be the wrong time, because the period would be too long until the actual major spike in the virus.
Yeah, all they're saying is if you close schools now, you're having to close them all the way till the end of the academic year, which obviously, if you have children, you don't need me to tell you that ultimately that means that is a huge change to people's life and working patterns. And the big fear here, and the thing that the government's scientific advisors think, is they think that actually countries like South Korea, which have shown progress in tackling the virus, are going to see that completely swept away when in a couple of weeks' time people go, I'm still in my house and I'm bored of it. Are they right? I mean, no one knows, because we have no experience of tackling this type of thing anywhere in the world.
Stephen and Kate, for the moment, thank you. Well, our coverage of the crisis continues on Sky News at breakfast tomorrow from 7 a.m. Coming up, a former health secretary says the government's response to the outbreak hasn't gone far enough. We'll tell you more in a moment. With me this evening, Kate Andrews and Stephen Bush, and we're going to take a look at the front page of the Mirror. The big question there, is it enough? And this follows on from, well, I guess you would say it's criticism from the former health secretary, Jeremy Hunt.
We spoke before the break about how other countries are taking different approaches to tackling the coronavirus, and some have decided to shut down schools and ban public gatherings already. The UK has not decided to do that yet. And here we have the former health secretary, Jeremy Hunt, suggesting that maybe the UK should pursue some of those options sooner. Now, he had a long tenure in the health department. This is a man who does know what he's talking about when it comes to healthcare, but he's not in cabinet, and he does not have access to the same level of advisors or strategic information that people like Boris Johnson will. So there will be conflicting opinions here, but I think the key is that this is carried out in a thoughtful way, which one would argue so far the former health secretary has done.
Yeah, I think in many ways, actually, partly because it's something of a relief away from the existential threat of COVID, but in many ways, actually, the important story here is political, right? Who are the people who usually create difficulty for governments, whether they are newly elected, as Boris Johnson is, or 10 years old, as the Conservative government is, or 13 years old, as New Labour were when they lost power? Sacked ministers, or ministers who've stepped down voluntarily. Why? Because the number one way you get rebels not to be unhelpful is you say, if you play the game, maybe next time you could be junior minister for paperclips. Jeremy Hunt's had a successful career. He doesn't, there is no job, the only job that he's interested in, he hasn't held, is Boris Johnson's, and bluntly, he's not going to have that one. And one of the things I think, the kind of unwritten story of this week, because of the much bigger story, the Huawei rebellion, who was the engine of it? Sacked ministers. And now you have another sacked minister making trouble for them. And one of the things that this Downing Street needs to get better at, I think, if it wants to continue in for a long time, is it's got to get better at managing these people. Otherwise, it's going to have many more stories like this and Commons defeats sooner rather than later.
Except in the case of Jeremy Hunt, there are those, we've heard those voices saying that the UK government isn't acting quickly enough, and we should be shutting down areas, we should be doing a lot more, schools should be closing, and we don't seem as proactive as other countries.
It's a tactic. It's a tactic. The UK government seems to think that the way it's going to handle coronavirus in the UK best is to delay the peak of it. And they are concerned that if they ask people to go inside too soon, they are doing so before the peak, and that could have repercussions when people start coming out of their homes, and we haven't tackled it yet. We don't we honestly, we don't know what the best tactic is. We don't know if South Korea or Italy or the UK has it. We're unfortunately probably going to know that in retrospect, but different countries are trying different things. And this is a moment to look to, say, the chief medical advisor for their advice in the UK. There's a good reason it may be different from other countries.
Let's move to America, and this is a piece in the Times, sort of comparing the way that Donald Trump and Joe Biden have approached this. Joe Biden obviously isn't president, but he's taken the sort of presidential role as if he were and has given a speech of what he would do in this instance.
Well, another story that might have been bigger this week had we not been focused on coronavirus, of course, is that Joe Biden has been doing very well in the Democratic primaries to become the presidential nominee. He won Michigan, and a lot of people in the U.S. now think he's basically got this sewn up. He is going to be the Democratic nominee. Bernie Sanders hasn't dropped out yet, but when Joe Biden gives a speech about coronavirus, many see it as the alternative to President Trump. And I'm in two minds about it personally. I think Joe Biden was much more presidential in his speech than Trump. This also isn't a moment for playing politics, but America's in a bit of a different situation because the president is thought to have handled this so poorly so far.
David?
Well, I guess it's a classic of dress for the job you want, not for the job you have. Joe Biden is acting like the president, kind of hoping that, it's like when you're interested in someone, you kind of pose with like a younger child, like maybe I could be the father of your children, right? That's essentially what Joe Biden is doing, and good luck to him.
It's that how you did it back in the day.
Stephen and Kate, thank you very much for taking us through the papers this evening. Good to see you. Should we take a look at the weather for you now?
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
It'll be a dry start for most of us on Friday before some wet and windy weather pushes in from the Atlantic. By dawn, most places will be rather cloudy. It'll be cold in the north with the risk of a frost and icy stretches on untreated roads. Eastern Scotland is looking rather breezy with a chance of a few showers, and Ireland could also see a few spots of rain. Elsewhere should be dry. During the morning, some wet and windy weather will push across southwest Ireland with showers ahead of it across South Wales and southwest England. A few showers are still likely across parts of eastern Scotland.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
كل اللي تقدر تروح كله ضعف. بعدين ما بيجي ضغط